deep within the secluded Cotswold Valley near Nymphsfield, stands a structure that defies the natural order of history and time. Woodchester Mansion is not merely a house that fell into ruin, but rather a creature that was never allowed to take its first breath. The limestone shell looms out of the dense forest canopy like a bleached skeleton of a leviathan stranded by a receding architectural tide. Visitors who approach the site often report a sudden and oppressive silence that descends upon the valley floor, where the birds stop singing and the wind ceases to rustle the leaves. This is the first warning that the land itself retains a memory of something that should not exist. The mansion is a masterpiece of the Gothic Revival style, yet it lacks the warmth of a completed home, and instead holds the cold, damp breath of the grave within its hollow walls. The story of this cursed place begins with a wealthy shipowner named William Lee, who purchased the Woodchester Park estate in the middle of the 19th century. He was a devout man who recently converted to the Roman Catholic faith and sought to build a grand residence that would reflect his religious fervor and social standing. However, William Lee was not the first to attempt to tame this dark valley, for there were pre-existing structures that had been destroyed to make way for his vision. The previous house, known as Spring Park, was demolished with haste, and some local historians suggest that the destruction disturbed ancient forces that had been dormant in the limestone bedrock. The ground here is rich with history, and perhaps something far older than the Victorian era was awakened when the foundations were dug into the earth. Construction began in the year 1858 under the guidance of a young and ambitious architect named Benjamin Bucknall. Bucknall was a disciple of the famous Violet Leduc, and he poured his soul into the design of Woodchester Mansion. The walls rose quickly from the valley floor, constructed of high-quality local limestone that was quarried from the estate itself. Masons and laborers worked tirelessly to craft intricate gargoyles and vaulted ceilings that rivaled the great cathedrals of Europe. Yet, despite the skill of the workmen and the wealth of William Lee, a palpable sense of unease began to permeate the building site. Tools would go missing only to appear in impossible places, and accidents became a frequent occurrence among the workforce. It was as if the house was resisting its own creation, fighting against the stone and mortar that sought to bind it together. The workmen often whispered among themselves about the strange atmosphere in the valley, especially as the sun dipped below the horizon. They spoke of shadows that moved independently of any light source, and of a feeling of being watched from the dark tree line that surrounded the construction site. The gargoyles that were carved to decorate the gutters seemed to take on a life of their own, with expressions that shifted from protective to malevolent when no one was looking directly at them. Despite these omens, the work continued for several years until a sudden and unexplained event brought everything to a grinding halt. In the year 1870, the workers downed their tools and left the site, almost instantly leaving the mansion in a state of suspended animation that it retains to this day. The official reason given for the abandonment was a lack of funds and the failing health of William Lee, but local legend paints a far darker picture. It is said that something terrified the master mason so profoundly that he ordered his men to leave immediately without even taking the time to pack their belongings. For decades, the mansion stood empty and incomplete, with ladders still leaning against walls and hods of mortar hardening into stone. The roof was finished, which protected the interior from the elements, but the floors were never laid, and the windows remained unglazed. The house became a hollow shell, a stone enclosure that trapped the darkness inside while the world outside moved on. It was during this long period of abandonment that the reputation of Woodchester Mansion began to fester and grow. The early 20th century brought new horrors to the valley as the world was plunged into the chaos of war. During the Second World War, the secluded grounds of Woodchester Park were used as a temporary base for American and Canadian troops who were preparing for the invasion of Europe. The soldiers set up camp in the shadow of the unfinished mansion, unaware of the dark history that permeated the soil. They were young men full of life and bravado. But the oppressive atmosphere of the valley soon began to weigh heavily on their spirits. It was during this time that a tragedy occurred, which would add a new layer of suffering to the spiritual fabric of the location. A training exercise involving a pontoon bridge over the man-made lakes went horribly wrong, resulting in a catastrophic failure. Several soldiers were plunged into the freezing waters when the bridge collapsed under the weight of their equipment, weighted down by their heavy gear. And panicked by the sudden immersion, the men struggled to stay afloat in the murky depths. Despite the desperate efforts of their comrades, several young lives were extinguished in the cold, dark water that day. Their bodies were eventually recovered, but the trauma of their final moments imprinted itself upon the landscape. Witnesses in the decades since have reported seeing uniformed figures standing by the water edge, staring silently into the depths before dissolving into mist. These restless spirits are bound to the site of their untimely demise, adding their sorrow to the ancient malice that already inhabited the valley. The mansion itself served as a temporary billet for some of the officers, and their experiences within the stone walls were far from peaceful. Reports from the time mention strange noises echoing through the empty corridors at night, and the sound of heavy boots marching on floorboards that did not exist. One officer wrote a letter home describing a feeling of intense cold that would fill his room regardless of how many fires were lit. He spoke of a tall shadow that would stand in the corner of the room, watching him as he slept. These wartime encounters were the first documented evidence that the entity within Woodchester Mansion was active and aware of the intruders who dared to trespass within its unfinished domain. As the years turned into decades, the mansion remained a desolate ruin, frequented only by vandals and thrill seekers who were brave enough to venture into the woods. It was not until the later part of the 20th century that the true extent of the paranormal activity became widely known. Restoration efforts began in order to preserve the structure as a historical monument. And with the return of human activity came a resurgence of supernatural phenomena. Workmen and volunteers reported tools being thrown by unseen hands, and the sensation of small stones being pelted at them from empty balconies. The unfinished nature of the house meant that sound traveled in strange ways, but the noises they heard could not be explained by acoustics alone. One of the most active areas in the mansion is the chapel, which William Lee had intended to be the spiritual heart of his home. It is a beautiful space with a high vaulted ceiling and intricate stone carvings that testify to the skill of the Victorian masons. However, the chapel is also the domain of a tall, imposing figure, often described as a monk or a priest. Witnesses have reported seeing this figure standing near the altar or moving silently through the stone archways. The air in the chapel often carries the distinct scent of burnt tallow candles, even though no open flame has been lit there for over a century. This olfactory manifestation is often accompanied by a sudden drop in temperature that chills visitors to the bone. The entity in the chapel does not seem to welcome the presence of the living, and many people have been overcome with a wave of nausea or dizziness upon entering the space. Some sensitive individuals have collapsed completely overwhelmed by the intense spiritual pressure that radiates from the stone walls. It is believed that this figure may be connected to the religious history of the site, or perhaps it is a manifestation of William Lee himself, forever mourning the incompletion of his grand design. The sadness in the chapel is palpable, a heavy blanket of grief that smothers all joy and leaves one feeling drained and empty. It is a place where faith was intended to flourish, but where only sorrow has taken root. Moving deeper into the mansion, one encounters the kitchen area, which has its own resident spirit. This entity is described as a man of shorter stature who appears to be dressed in working clothes typical of the 19th century. He is often seen standing in the shadows of the large fireplaces or disappearing into the pantry. Unlike the solemn figure in the chapel, this ghost seems to be more agitated and aggressive. Visitors have reported hearing the sound of pots and pans being crashed together, even though the kitchen has been empty of such items for generations. This poltergeist activity suggests a frustration that has not diminished with the passage of time, a rage born of unfinished labor and unfulfilled purpose. The most terrifying encounters, however, take place in the cellar, a dark and damp labyrinth of stone arches that runs beneath the entire house. This subterranean level is the domain of a dark entity that is believed to be much older and more dangerous than the human spirits that wander the upper floors. Paranormal investigators refer to this being as an elemental or a guardian, a force of nature that is hostile to human life. The atmosphere in the cellar is thick with malice, and many people have been physically attacked while exploring its depths. Scratches, bites, and bruises have appeared on the bodies of visitors who dared to linger too long in the darkness. There is a specific corridor in the cellar that seems to be the focal point of this dark energy. It is a narrow passage where the air is stagnant and the silence is deafening. Those who walk down this corridor often report the sensation of being followed by something large and predatory. The feeling is not just of being watched, but of being hunted. Some have heard a low growl emanating from the shadows, a sound that vibrates in the chest and triggers a primal fear response. This is not the ghost of a dead man, but something else entirely, something that feeds on fear and thrives in the absence of light. It is the unfinished business of the earth itself, reclaiming the space that was stolen from it. Above the cellar on the first floor lies another room with a notorious reputation known as the bathroom. It was never plumbed and never used, yet it is the site of one of the most disturbing apparitions in the mansion. Witnesses have reported seeing a floating head in this room, a disembodied face that hovers in the air with a twisted expression of agony. The face is described as pale and gaunt with hollow eyes that seem to stare right through the viewer. There is no body attached to this horrifying visage, and it often vanishes as quickly as it appears, leaving the witness questioning their own sanity. The origin of this spirit is unknown, but its presence adds a surreal and nightmarish quality to the haunting. The unfinished state of the mansion allows for a unique type of haunting where the spirits are not bound by the layout of a completed house. Ghosts have been seen walking through walls where doors were intended to be, and looking out of windows that were never glazed. The lack of floorboards in some areas means that one can look up from the ground floor and see all the way to the roof, creating a dizzying perspective that disorients the mind. In this vertical shaft of space, shadows can be seen flitting between the wooden beams, high above, moving with a fluid grace that defies gravity. It is a three-dimensional haunt where danger can come from above as well as from the sides. There is a persistent legend involving a dark man who stands on the bridge that leads to the mansion. He is often mistaken for a security guard or a staff member until he vanishes into thin air. This sentinel seems to guard the approach to the house, warning visitors away before they even cross the threshold. He is described as wearing a long dark coat and a hat that obscures his face. Those who have encountered him say that he radiates a sense of authority and menace. He does not speak, but his presence is a clear command to turn back and leave this place alone. He is the first line of defense for the secrets that Woodchester Mansion holds. The paranormal activity at Woodchester Mansion is not limited to visual apparitions and auditory phenomena. There is a physical component to the haunting that makes it particularly dangerous. Stones are frequently thrown at visitors, often with significant force. These are not small pebbles falling from the crumbling masonry, but fist-sized rocks that are hurled horizontally across the rooms. There is an intelligence behind these attacks, a deliberate attempt to harm or drive away intruders. People have been struck on the head and shoulders, leaving painful welts and bruises. The entities here are not passive recordings of the past. They are active and hostile participants in the present. One particularly chilling account comes from a group of paranormal investigators who spent a night in the mansion during the late 1990s. They were set up in the main hall, recording audio and video, when they heard the distinct sound of heavy footsteps approaching from the corridor. The footsteps were slow and deliberate sounding, like hobnailed boots striking the stone floor. As the sound got closer, the temperature in the room plummeted, and their equipment began to malfunction. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall slammed shut with tremendous force, trapping them inside. Panic set in as they realized they were not alone in the dark. The investigators huddled together, shining their flashlights into the gloom, trying to identify the source of the disturbance. Out of the shadows emerged a dense black mass darker than the surrounding night. It moved with a purposeful gait, shifting its shape as it advanced toward them. The air was filled with the smell of rotting vegetation and stagnant water. Just as the entity reached them, it dissipated into a cloud of icy mist, leaving the group trembling and terrified. They fled the mansion, immediately vowing never to return. Their recording devices later revealed strange guttural voices that were not audible at the time, confirming that they had been in the presence of something demonic. Another recurring phenomenon is the sound of music echoing through the empty halls. It is often described as 1940s style music, reminiscent of the time when the soldiers were stationed there. The faint strains of a big band or a slow jazz number can be heard drifting from the upper floors, as if a ghostly dance is taking place in a ballroom that was never built. This spectral music is often accompanied by the sound of laughter and the clinking of glasses, creating a bizarre juxtaposition between the festive sounds of the past and the desolate reality of the present. It is a cruel echo of the life that was brought to the valley by the war only to be cut short by tragedy. The haunting of Woodchester Mansion is not confined to the interior of the building. The surrounding parkland is equally active, with reports of phantom horsemen riding through the woods. These riders are believed to be connected to the earlier history of the estate, perhaps from the time of the Spring Park House. The sound of galloping hooves can be heard thundering down the valley tracks, even when no animals are present. Hikers have reported being forced off the path by an invisible force that rushed past them, leaving a trail of displaced air and the smell of horse sweat. The valley itself seems to be a conduit for supernatural energy, trapping these echoes of the past in a continuous loop. There are theories that the mansion was built on a convergence of ley lines, ancient paths of energy that crisscross the landscape. This would explain why the site has such a high concentration of paranormal activity, and why the construction was so plagued by misfortune. The stone of the mansion acts as a battery, storing this energy and releasing it in the form of hauntings. The incomplete nature of the building may have left these energy channels open, allowing entities from other planes of existence to enter our world. It is a gateway that was opened, but never closed a wound in the spiritual fabric of the Cotswolds. Animals are particularly sensitive to the presence of the entities at Woodchester. Dogs often refuse to enter the mansion, bracing their legs and whining in distress. Those that are dragged inside often exhibit signs of extreme fear, cowering in corners, or barking aggressively at empty space. There have been reports of birds flying into the building and dropping dead mid-flight, as if they hit an invisible wall of negative energy. The natural world seems to reject the mansion, recognizing it as an aberration that does not belong. This reaction from animals serves as a potent warning to humans that they are entering a place where the laws of nature are distorted. A local woman who visited the mansion on a guided tour reported a terrifying experience in the scullery. She felt a small, cold hand slip into hers, as if a child was seeking comfort. At first, she thought it was one of the other guests' children, but when she looked down, she saw no one. The sensation of the small hand gripping hers persisted, and she felt a wave of overwhelming sadness wash over her. She began to weep uncontrollably, overcome by the emotions of a long-dead child. When she finally pulled her hand away, she saw distinct red marks on her skin where the phantom fingers had held her. This encounter suggests that not all the spirits are malevolent. Some are just lost and lonely. The most dangerous time to be at Woodchester Mansion is undoubtedly at night. The darkness transforms the skeletal structure into a labyrinth of shadows where every corner could conceal a threat. The moonlight filtering through the empty window frames casts long, distorted shapes on the stone floors, creating a shifting landscape of light and dark. It is during these hours that the elemental in the cellar is most active, prowling the corridors like a predator. Night watchmen have reported hearing growls and scratches on the doors of their secure rooms. Some have quit after a single shift, unable to withstand the psychological pressure of being hunted by an unseen beast. There is a room on the second floor that is known for its intense cold spots. Even in the height of summer, the temperature in this room can drop to freezing levels within seconds. Visitors can see their breath misting in the air, and frost has been known to form on the stone walls. This localized freezing is a classic sign of a spirit drawing energy from the environment to manifest. The cold is not just physical, it is a spiritual chill that penetrates the soul, leaving one feeling drained and exhausted. It is as if the life force is being sucked out of the living to feed the dead. The unfinished nature of the mansion is perhaps its most haunting quality. It is a monument to failure, a dream that turned into a nightmare. The empty door frames and unglazed windows are like the eyes and mouth of a skull, staring blankly out at the world. The house is caught in a state of limbo, neither fully alive nor truly dead. It is this state of transition that makes it such a potent magnet for spirits. They are drawn to the incompleteness, to the potential that was never realized. The mansion is a blank canvas upon which the dead can project their memories and their rage. One specific encounter sums up the horror of Woodchester Mansion. A lone photographer ventured into the cellar to capture the architecture in the fading light. As he set up his tripod, he felt a heavy hand land on his shoulder. Assuming it was a security guard, he turned around to apologize for being there after hours. Behind him stood a massive shadow, a towering figure of pure darkness that seemed to absorb the light from his torch. The figure leaned in close, and the photographer heard a raspy voice whisper, "Get out," right in his ear. He abandoned his expensive camera and ran for his life, never looking back. When the camera was retrieved days later, the film was completely black. Today, Woodchester Mansion stands as a chilling reminder that some doors should never be opened. It is a place where the past bleeds into the present, and where the dead walk among the living. The restoration work continues slowly, but the spirits show no sign of leaving. They are the true owners of the house, the eternal tenants of the unfinished rooms. As you leave the valley and the silence lifts, you cannot shake the feeling that something is still watching you from the shadows of the tree line. The mansion remains unfinished, but the business of the ghosts within is far from over. They wait in the dark, patient and hungry for the next visitor to cross the threshold.